Okay. Looks good. So it's preparing the live stream. Great. Okay. So we are also live now. So then let's start. Hello, everyone. So good morning. I indeed do hope that you had all a good summer, taking some time off and not thinking too much about politics or the climate crisis. Of course, it's very difficult in this very challenging times. It's indeed not easy. And we saw again a summer with record-setting temperatures. We are seeing floods in Europe. We are seeing at the same time extreme droughts all over Europe. We are witnessing forests on fire. So this is clearly a sign of the climate crisis, the climate change happening at the same time. So just a few housekeeping rules. I'll ask everyone joining our Zoom conference to switch out his or her camera and microphone. We will have a very distinguished panelists today. Of course, they will use their camera. So we will have Sarah Mbarek present from the Joint Research Center. We will have Daniel, or we do have Daniel Reinemann from Bioenergy Europe with us, and we do have Mary Booth from Partnership for Policy Integrity also with us. We are recording this session for internal purposes and live streaming to my YouTube page. So if you are raising questions, you will be also streamed to YouTube. So just to be aware. Please raise your questions in the chat. This makes it easier for everyone to prepare answers. Okay, with these housekeeping rules, let me come back to the topic. We do see a self-reinforcing problem. The forests are under stress by the climate change, and when forests are starting to burn, they are reinforcing the climate crisis. So we have to think how we make our forests more sustainable. This is nothing that can be done overnight, obviously, but the good thing is that we can influence forest management with European legislation. One big piece of the puzzle is the Renewable Energy Directive, as you are all aware. The reform was proposed by the Commission last year as part of its big climate package. And in this legislation, the European Union defines which sources of energy are designated as renewable. So for woody biomass, it defines the corresponding sustainability criteria, and the Commission has already proposed some elements to change the legislation. But in the eyes of many, this was not enough. For example, the JRC of the Commission, from which we will, as I already said, will hear later, has identified some gaps in the proposal. Just to underline the first one, the proposal did not explicitly mention coarse woody debris. These are the bigger parts of trees that are residues from fellings and should stay in the forest, according to the JRC. Secondly, the red proposal only stipulates use of low stumps and roots for energy should be avoided. But the JRC writes it should be forbidden or discouraged. And finally, the red proposal did not reference conversions of semi-natural forest to plantation forest. So therefore, the ENVI committee before the summer break in May voted to restrict the counting of woody biomass as sustainable. Most of primary woody biomass should not be counted as renewable energy. So primary woody biomass is the biomass that is directly coming from the forest. EU-wide, this is roughly half of the woody biomass that is used for energy purposes. The other half are residues from industries and old woody products. The goals of ENVI with this vote are the following three. The first one, leaving more trees and residues of trees in the forest as a carbon sink. So we could reach the critical 1.5 degrees mark within even the next decade. Therefore, every tone that we can bind in a sink is every ton that we can bind in a sink is very valuable. Secondly, making more wood available for forest industries like construction. The wood prices are skyrocketing even before the start of the inflation. And they were skyrocketing, as I said, before the war started. So we want to use more wood from construction where it also is a carbon sink. This is also one of the aims of the Bauhaus initiative. And this only works if wood is affordable. And last but not least, by discouraging monoculture plantations, we want to make forests more resilient against droughts and heat waves. So maybe these few highlights, and then what are the next steps in the process? The plenary of the European Parliament on the vote, the Parliament's vote on the Renewable Energy Directive is foreseen in 2 weeks. Therefore, I want to discuss today this topic again with panelists from, as I mentioned, from industry, from civil society and science. And I want to raise the following questions. First question is, can wood burning help the European Union to meet the climate, biodiversity and air quality goals? That's the first one. The second one, what provisions in the RED do we need to reverse the trend of shrinking EU forest sinks? And thirdly, how should we implement and enforce the cascading principle? So as an explanation, the Commission has proposed to enshrine the cascading principle in the directive. The goal is that products are used according to its highest environmental value. It should prevent it, for example, that whole trees are used for energy purposes. And I want to ask one more additional question to the panelists. So the fourth one is, we have a ceiling for the use of food and feed-based crops, also in RED. Would it be a good idea to put a cap and a phase down for counting primary woody biomass as renewable energy on national level? In my eyes, this could provide a transition for member states that at the moment, this could provide a transition for member states which are using primary woody biomass at the moment. So, and with this additional question to the three previous ones, I would like to pass the floor for the start to kick off to Sarah from the JRC. She works for the European Commission, but is part of the scientific corps and not a policy officer. She is here for the scientific input and ready to be asked, of course, questions of scientific nature, but not political nature. And so I can see that we can see already your screen. That's good. Without further ado, Sarah, I would like you to come in first.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction and for this background. Yes, so my name is Sarah Mubareka. I'm here. We were invited here actually to answer 4 questions because we published a recent paper on the topic of forest bioenergy pathways. So I'm going to address the questions directly here in this presentation. I hope that's okay. But first, just one slide on why are we discussing this problem at all? Why are we discussing forest bioenergy in the first place? Well, the condition of many forest ecosystems in Europe and around the world is actually deteriorating. Bioenergy is actually very peculiar because it's at the nexus of current environmental crises, climate and biodiversity, and you mentioned also air quality. And bioenergy places ultimately, whether it's directly or indirectly, some pressure on forest ecosystems because there is an additional demand for woody biomass somewhere in the system. So what we found is that the use of woody biomass for bioenergy has actually increased by a little over 30% over the past decade. It's actually 9 years of study in EU 27. So that's why we're discussing this today, because of all of these and other elements of the whole context. So the first question was, can wood burning help meet EU climate and biodiversity goals? Well, The environmental sustainability of forest bioenergy is actually the subject of a very long, lengthy and scientific, not only scientific, but also societal debate. And actually in the literature, there are different and sometimes contradicting conclusions. So it's really confusing for policymakers. The reasons for this is that there are, the analysis may be done on multiple spatial scales, or yes, different modeling tools are used. So ultimately, even though there are multiple valid perspectives, really the conclusions very much depend on the framing of the problem. And one of the framing elements that I wanted to highlight here today is a lot of work is done on climate, but what about biodiversity? So bioenergy is promoted as a climate change mitigation strategy, but what about ecosystem condition? We were actually really surprised to learn that only 3 out of the 100 most cited LCA, life cycle assessment studies on bioenergy, has actually analyzed impact on biodiversity. And so we know in parallel that the EU forest condition is on the average degrading due to pressures, and that in a recent report on mapping and assessing ecosystem services, we know that one of the main pressures that's identified, or the main pressure, is forest activities. And so putting all of these elements together, we realized, okay, somebody has to do an assessment on climate change mitigation potential and the potential for biodiversity impact when we look at bioenergy. So that's what we did. So despite a lack of the specific focus on biodiversity within the bioenergy literature, there's a lot of information, a lot of literature out there about the impacts of different forest management practices on forest ecosystems. So what we did is we sort of married that literature to the bioenergy literature, and we investigated the impacts of a limited number of pathways that could be driven by an increase in woody biomass demand. So it's important that I highlight here, you see the bubbles on this matrix, and then I'll explain this matrix in a moment, but the number of bubbles represents pathways. So how would we obtain woody biomass for bioenergy? We had to constrain the studies so we don't look at all pathways. You can read about that in our paper, and I'm here to tell you about that if it comes up in the debate. But the novelty of this work was actually to plot climate change mitigation against biodiversity and ecosystem condition assessment. Okay, so what you see on the y-axis is actually the climate change mitigation potential. It goes from short-term potential to there is no potential, or it's very, very long-term. So outside of a very long time from now. And then on the x-axis, you see the biodiversity impact. There's either a neutral impact or positive impact, or it's a high-risk pathway. And what we found is that there are some win-win pathways. One would be, for example, using fine woody debris below, of course, ecologically acceptable thresholds, or afforestation of former agricultural land with mixed forests or naturally regenerating forests. And then we have other pathways that are actually considered as silver bullet pathways, or we call them bioperversity pathways, because we think, or we thought, that these would be appropriate pathways to obtain more biomass for bioenergy, such as afforesting agricultural land with monoculture plantation, or afforesting grasslands or heathlands, but actually they're not positive for biodiversity ecosystem condition. And then there are classic lose-lose, which is harvesting coarse woody debris, as the honorable member spoke of earlier, and conversion of primary forest to plantation, of course, primary forest, but also semi-natural forest to plantation. So summarizing this, alternatives do exist to large-scale bioenergy as a mitigation strategy, we feel. I mean, humans are incredible engineers, but one thing we can't create is healthy functional forest ecosystems. Therefore, we suggest that we focus our energies to finding alternatives to large-scale bioenergy. We also think that we should refocus our scenario work. So we rely a lot on modeling. There are many new papers and initiatives now talking about this. We think that scenarios that achieve climate targets without expansion of bioenergy should be explored, as should demand side solution scenarios. So what about if we just simply consume less? What about degrowth scenarios? So these are not the scenarios that you read about in the literature. That maybe would be worth examining. Furthermore, in legislative impact assessments, there's not a necessarily clear quantitative method for assessing biodiversity and ecosystem condition. This would be important. And overall, we think that the precautionary principle should be applied. Therefore, when in doubt, via negativa, do not do it. So avoid lose-lose and bioperversity pathways. Be cautious about scales of demand and lock-in. So if new bioenergy business models are emerging, be aware that that implies investment, not only of money, facilities, workforce, and then it's very hard to get out of that afterwards. Not to speak of the lock-in of the biomass demand that you're creating. So be cautious also with imported feedstocks, not only for issues of energy security, which I'm sure will come up in the debate later, but also because of the potential leakage of carbon emissions and other environmental and socio-economic impacts that are very hard for us from outside to quantify. And be mindful that there are probably alternatives. This comes back to my first point. The second question was, what red provisions do we need to reverse the trend? I'm mindful of the time, so I will. The first part was the longest. Now it's quite short. So why is the forest sink shrinking in the EU? Well, if you look at this graph, we have 3 lines. The first reason for a shrinking sink is an aging forest. So forest increment is declining. The net growth of forest in the EU is sort of leveling off. Then we have this yellow line here that's showing that we have an increase in natural disturbances. So this was also mentioned in the introductory words, that fires, pests, windstorms, these are increasing over time, and therefore massive amounts of biomass are promptly removed in 1 year. And then we have the usual, of course, harvest. In order to meet our demands, we have harvest, and this is also increasing over time. So solutions can be addressed at each of these levels. So the question was, how should we implement what red provisions do we need to reverse the trend of shrinking EU forest sinks? But actually, that's the aim of another regulation, the LULUCF regulation. But one thing that we often say in our reports and in this paper that I'm referring to is that there are trade-offs at national level with respect to the LULUCF regulation and the RED directive. And it's important that these are well known at operators level, but mainly at national level as well. So it would be important to avoid that bioenergy use jeopardizes EU climate, so LULUCF goals, and also the biodiversity goals as outlined in the forest strategy and under the Green Deal in general. So how should we implement and enforce the cascading principle? Well, the cascading principle we know is we want to prioritize environmentally and economically prioritize woody biomass. So we start with wood-based products. We try to extend their life service, then reuse, recycle, and then move to bioenergy and then disposal. And there are environmental benefits to this that are known, but there are also barriers, and it's important to acknowledge these barriers. There are technological barriers. You need facilities, you need knowledge, you need a workforce to actually reuse and recycle woody biomass. There are limitations to how many times you can reuse woody biomass, of course. And then there are also governance barriers as well. What we've done here at the JRC is we've assessed basically the woody biomass flows, and you can see here that the forest-based sector, of course, already has a high level of circularity. You see a lot of loops in this diagram. Regardless, there is still a direct use of primary wood for energy. That's that light green arrow that goes from the top of the graph to the bottom blue part. And this has actually increased, so that arrow has gotten fatter and fatter over the years. Now we're at about 188 million cubic meters of solid wood equivalent. That's under bark. The bark is the dark green arrow. But it was 136 million cubic meters in 2009. And the amount of unreported primary wood has actually increased over the years. So we're looking, of course, at annual data, and we noted that unreported primary wood is increasing. How can we implement and enforce the cascading principle? I mean, it's not our role to put in place governance tools, but we recognize, at least we have the ability to recognize that it's actually not easy to do this. To make it fully operational means understanding economic arguments, for example, added value, and that's not easy to assess. But what we can say is that to support policymakers, we do need good data. So the graph that you saw before, the picture you saw before, is based largely on voluntary schemes and a lot of assumptions. So we have to use coefficients in order to extract, okay, the bark, the solid wood equivalent, etc. And so it's important that we have good data in order to produce a really solid science on which policy can be based. Right, so the forest-based sector is highly circular, but still a significant amount of primary wood is used for bioenergy. And a lot of that is low-quality round wood. And then, of course, there are the byproducts and post-consumer wood that's used also for bioenergy. They may have higher use values. It would be worth dialoguing with industry to understand the barriers that they encounter and which challenges they've encountered in order, to use this woody biomass for other purposes other than bioenergy. But this last point is my last point overall, is that be aware that any breakthrough or operationalization of any use of woody biomass for any purpose will overall ultimately likely result in an overall increase in consumption and harvest anyway. Okay. Thank you very much for listening.
Sarah, thank you very much for this presentation. And I realized there was a new picture, a new graphic. The first one, it's I think this was very good, very good to understand. As you saved us 2 minutes, I just want to bring in one question. I think it's good to that you directly reply. John Mark from SecGen of Bioenergy Europe in the chat said, as I understand the JRC, win-win pathways are primary woody biomass, exclamation mark. That's not how I understood it so far, but maybe you can just come in quickly on this before we move on.
Sure, I'll actually post a frequently asked questions link, because that's not the first time we hear that. And that's why I wanted to emphasize the fact that we didn't look at all pathways, and we don't look at industrial byproducts, for example, as a pathway. So of the pathways that we investigated, what we consider aspirational pathways. Why? Because we see that the trend for use of woody biomass for bioenergy is increasing. So we assume that we will have to find new ways of mobilizing biomass for bioenergy. We've investigated only these pathways, and they're only pathways from forest management. So they're forest management and land management pathways.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the clarification, and we are looking forward for the link to the FAQ. So thank you very much. I think I didn't explicitly mention we will have in the end room and time for an open debate. So I just wanted to bring this in very quickly. And now actually we are moving on to a representative of Bioenergy Europe. We have with us Daniel Reinemann. I hope, Daniel, that you have been able to fix the technical issues so that you can share your slides with us.
I don't have permission to do so yet.
That's not deliberately. Just give me a sec. So I have to, where is it? Daniel. And now you should be able to share your screen.
Yes, now I can.
Sorry.
All right. Well, first off, thank you very much, Mr. Vulcan, for the opportunity to speak today, and thank you all for attending this webinar about such an important topic. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk to you today. So the first thing I wanted to start off with is just talking a little bit about energy and bioenergy in particular. When we talk about energy, we oftentimes conflate that with electricity, but electricity is actually only a quarter of the EU's energy use. Nearly half of it comes from heating and cooling, and a quarter comes from transportation. And actually, with regards to the heating and cooling, this is where we see bioenergy playing the biggest role. In 2019, it accounted for 85% of all of the renewable heating that we had. And when we look at the energy sector more broadly, we see that it is overall completely dominated by non-renewable sources, and that continues to be the case. So in 2019, bioenergy was 11.4% of the total energy. And when we look at renewables overall, they were only 19.7%. So that means that we have a system as of a couple of years ago that was still over 80% dependent upon fossil sources, on nuclear, on other non-renewable sources. And of all of the renewables that we have, bioenergy does currently make up the biggest share. In 2019, it was responsible for 57.4%. So an important contributor to our green transition. And also, when we're talking about different energy sources, it's important to note too that bioenergy is a largely domestically produced resource here in Europe. So especially when we compare this with other imported fuels, fossil fuels, we see that there's a very dramatic difference in the kind of situation that we're facing. So bioenergy is the largest domestically produced source of energy in the EU. Whereas if you look at natural gas, we're 84% dependent upon imports. With oil, petroleum products, that's up to 95% compared to under 4% for bioenergy. And biomass for energy makes up less than 1% of all of our energy imports, which is very important to keep in mind in our current energy framework. So now I just wanted to go through and give a quick overview of what else I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to start off talking about some forestry issues, and then move on to the carbon sink, talk about material flows and industry, and then finally wrap up with a few final points on air quality, biodiversity, and forest vulnerability. So the first thing I want to do is just make a quick distinction between carbon stock and carbon sink, as these terms are sometimes used interchangeably in the debate, but they have very different meanings. So when we're talking about a carbon stock, we're talking about the total amount of stored carbon. And so you can think of this as kind of like a bathtub, which holds a certain amount of water in it at a time. A carbon sink is going to be an annual change in that stored level of carbon. And so you can think of this as kind of a faucet with water going through, and it's the rate of flow. It's how much carbon is being stored each year. So while they are definitely linked with each other, they are very different concepts. So turning first to look at what is the potential of biomass that is available. Here we have wood flow analysis done by the European Union. And it looks first at the theoretical potential of biomass that exists. And then it goes through and it removes a certain portion of that, saying it's not available for the wood supply, for technological constraints, but importantly, also environmental constraints. And after that, you arrive at what is called the available wood supply. So that's the amount of biomass that can be used on an annual level that can be harvested. And this accounts for what's dying and what's being regrown. And so of the available wood supply that we have here in Europe, it's actually only around 2/3 of it that is currently being utilized by the bioeconomy. The rest is just being left to continue growing in the forest, meaning that our forests are continuing to grow and expand beyond what they need in order to just maintain themselves. So looking at the net annual increment, which is the amount of yearly growth in the forest, we can see that any kind of harvesting rate below 100% of the net annual increment is going to ensure that our forests are going to continue to grow. And over the past 30 years, we've actually seen constant growth in European forests. The forest area in Europe has been increasing at an average of about 1.25 football fields a minute. And it's not just the area of our forest that's increasing, but it's also the forest density. So we've seen that the forest density over the past 30 years has also quite dramatically increased. And for all of the countries that had data provided for the State of European Forest 2020 report, we can see that all of them remain below the net annual increment harvesting levels, which means that across Europe, forests are continuing to grow. So turning now to talk a bit about the carbon sink, here, as was discussed earlier, it is very closely related to the net annual increment. So when we look at the period between like 1980 and 1990, there we saw that the net annual increment was increasing quite dramatically, and thus we also saw an increase in the carbon sink. Just a quick note on this graph, you do have the 0 at the top for the carbon sink. So going down is an increase in the carbon sink versus on the left, we have the net annual increment, which starts at 0 at the bottom and then increases going to the top. But then when we look at more recent data from 2000 to 2010, there we see that the net annual increment is starting to stagnate. And that's resulting in a similar trend happening in the carbon sink. And this, as was mentioned, is a factor of the forest getting older and how much carbon is able to be absorbed. So when we're talking about what the impacts are, it's very important that we consider this from a landscape perspective, because that is how the atmosphere is interacting with our forests. If you're looking at individual plots, it's not going to quite represent the interactions that are taking place on the macro level. And it's also very important to keep in mind that we are in a situation where we are facing increasing climate pressures, we're facing different climatic conditions, increased drought, increased temperature, and all of this is going to provide additional stress on the forests, and leaving the forest untouched isn't going to be as effective of a strategy when the forests are under more and more stress, because this means that there are going to be increased disturbances, increased forest fires, increased pest outbreaks, and all of that is just going to be exacerbated if there is no active management. Because we did see historically over centuries that there was mismanagement of Europe's forest resources, and given the lifespan of forests of 80 to 150 years for the life cycle of a tree, this is not something that can be fixed in just a couple of decades, and this is something that requires ongoing active management to go through and undo the damage that has been done previously. So turning now to look at where different parts of trees are going to, when we're talking about forestry activities, unfortunately, not the entire tree can be used for high quality, long-lived wood products, because not all of it is of the right criteria for that. And so we do see different parts of the tree being utilized for different industrial applications. So here I wanted to go through and actually turn to something that was mentioned a bit before, and looking at how the flow through industry is being done. So when we look at our wood resources, we see that there were 617 million cubic meters of solid wood equivalent in the wood industry for 2017. You see that at the top. And when we look, we see that 60% of it is going to industry, and then you have roughly 10% that is bark, with the remainder being used for bioenergy, which is primary woody biomass. But when we look at that, we have to keep in mind that not all primary woody biomass is of high quality and can be used for these other industrial purposes. Some of it could be broken, it could be too small, it could be damaged by fungi or mold, it could be crooked. There are a lot of different reasons why this biomass is rejected by other industries, and therefore it's not going to have any other use if it's not being used for bioenergy. But when we look at the bottom part of the graph, we do see that we have quite a large share. We have 424 million cubic meters of solid wood equivalent being used for bioenergy. And I do understand how people can look at that and be concerned by that, because here we went from having 60% being sent to industry, and now we have 60% being used in bioenergy and just 15% ending up as sawwood. What's important to keep in mind here is that when we're talking about how these industries operate, there are inherently certain inefficiencies. When we're talking about the sawmill industry, they have brown trees, but they need square boards. And this is going to result in a lot of residues, a lot of bark, a lot of sawdust, a lot of chips, in order to get their byproduct, in order to get their products. And so that's why when you do look at the center part of this diagram, you do see that not quite half, but a substantial portion of the input to the sawmill industry then goes through and becomes a byproduct or a residue. And all of this means that when we look at the sources for bioenergy, that there is a significant portion that is coming from low quality primary woody biomass, but that isn't necessarily a problem. And as I was mentioning previously, as forests are put under more and more stress, as we have more wind throw events due to extreme weather, more pest outbreaks, more forest fires, that's going to increase the amount of low quality wood that's being generated that can't be used for other industries. And as I mentioned, we have a very small portion coming from imports here. So looking at how this should be regulated through the cascading principle, well, I would argue very strongly that the cascading principle is already being applied in practice. When we look at the market, we do see very clearly different prices between high quality saw logs and low quality forest residues that are used for bioenergy. The data here is coming from Balpool, one of the leading timber statistics sites for data on the Baltics. And here they're going through, and you can see even after the energy crisis and during the turbulent times in the market over the past couple of years, prices have increased across the board, but we do see that forest residues continue to be lower valued than high quality saw logs, than pulpwood. And so we do see very clear differentiation in how the market is already acting. And it's very difficult to go through and to determine this at a centralized legal level of how every material should be used in every situation. And this also has the potential, if it's too strictly applied, to go through and to stifle innovation and prevent materials from going to better uses that we might develop in the future. So turning now to a couple of the other points that were raised, talking about air quality. One thing that's important to talk about is that when we're talking about today's modern appliances, it is very different from what we have had historically, and there are significantly lower emissions. We see that with today's modern stoves, you can get 80 to 90% reductions of what you had with an open fire or with an old stove. In terms of particulate emissions, we see similar improvements in organic gaseous compounds. There are at least 60 to 70% reductions. And the data that I'm pointing to here is actually from 11 years ago, and we've continued to see increases since then. And how to most efficiently use this material, ensure a clean, complete combustion, and apply better filtration systems that ensure that air quality is improved. Looking also to biodiversity, this is of course also something that is incredibly important. And here I turn again to some data that was provided by the State of European Forest Report in 2020. And they were looking at the common bird species index. And this index is quite commonly used because bird species are sensitive to a lot of different parameters. And here we do see that there have been some slight fluctuations of around 15% from a 1980 baseline, but we don't see any statistically significant changes from then until now. The most recent data in 2017, we actually saw 102% of the 1980 baseline. Of course, it's important not to read too much into the data from any particular one year. But when we're looking at this in comparison with the situation in bioenergy, we see that the amount of shares of wood that have been removed for energy have been pretty much stable at around 20%. Meanwhile, bioenergy itself has more than doubled since 2000. So we do see that this is coming from greater efficiencies in the market, and that we are able to go through and sustain this growth in a way that isn't environmentally harmful. And the final thing I want to talk about is just looking at the vulnerability of our forests, because we have seen that this particular year has been quite damaging for them. We've already gone through and had more area burned than we have in an average year. And so far, we are quite far above the maximum amount that we have seen in the past 15 years. So this is a very significant problem, and we are going to have to consider different ways of actively managing our forests, such as setting up these fire breaks that you can see here in this picture, which prevents a forest fire from being able to spread across an entire forest unchecked. And if we are going through and doing those kinds of activities, it is going to be generating additional biomass, and that biomass is going to have to be used for something. Some of it is going to be of low quality and not suitable for other industries, and therefore it will be important to allow it to continue being used for sustainable bioenergy. So that's what I had for you today. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your presentation. And I can see there's already an active discussion happening in the chat. That's great. That's why we are hosting it. And we will, as I said, we scheduled this for time until 12:30. So I suggest that we now continue with Mary and her presentation. After that, we will have enough of time and room to discuss, to answer questions. Yeah. So thank you, Daniel, so far. And I can see that Mary already turned on her camera, and I'm sure that she will start sharing her screen. Mary, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks for attending the webinar. I'm really honored to be asked to present. I'm Mary Booth. I am an ecosystem ecologist. I have a PhD in ecology, and I've been working on biomass energy issues for about 15 years now. And I've been particularly focusing on the EU policy for the last 3 or so years. I'm going to cut right to the chase. We were asked to answer some questions. So the NGO position, which I'm here to represent, which is based on science, and I'm going to give links for most of the statements that I make in my talk today, is that policymakers must define primary woody biomass using the recognized international standard, not the current sort of custom definition that is in the Environment Committee proposal to stop using primary woody biomass toward renewable energy targets. Stop counting any primary woody biomass, which I'm going to call from here on out forest biomass, toward renewable energy targets, and end all subsidies. CAP won't get the job done. It's not going to be enough because degradation of forests is occurring under current levels of harvesting. And to turn that around, we got to reduce harvesting. It's extremely important to enact a strong delegated act on the cascading principle that will ensure that secondary woody biomass, mill residues, et cetera, counts as renewable energy only if there's no higher use. This is not a ban on wood burning. Nothing about this proposal would stop people from burning wood in any way, shape, or form. And it's not a proposal to keep forests untouched. It's simply a proposal to stop counting forest biomass toward renewable energy targets. And if that happens, then it would no longer be subsidized. I want to run through some biomass impacts and facts with you just before I get into the business about the forest carbon sink, which is sort of the meat of the matter. More than half the wood harvested in the EU is burned for energy. Burning biomass emits 50% more CO2 per megawatt hour than coal in an electricity power plant, and the percentage more than natural gas is a lot more than that. CO2 from burning wood for energy in the EU is now over 400 million tons per year. It's similar to the total reported emissions of Poland or Italy. And it's 20 times the emissions of the major fires this summer. So yes, of course, we have to be extremely concerned about fires. I mean, that's a terrible thing what's happening. But when it comes to CO2 emissions, the EU is voluntarily paying people to burn wood that is emitting a lot more CO2 per year. The European Commission's own impact assessment states that net emissions from burning forest wood exceed those from fossil fuels for decades to centuries, for the simple reason that combustion emits CO2 quickly while forests regrow slowly. The proposed RED reforms do nothing to address the climate impacts of bioenergy. Nothing in the sustainability or greenhouse gas criteria can change the fact that burning biomass emits a lot of CO2 and it just doesn't get offset very quickly. The EU is wasting around 17 billion per year of taxpayer money on bioenergy subsidies, and the majority of that is going to wood burning power plants. I just wanted to show Sarah's slide one more time. This is just to drill down a little bit more on what these scenarios mean. I've broken out, I went through the JRC report and added these boxes on the left just to show what those timeframes mean. So the scenario that shows limited removal of fine woody debris has, reasonably fast carbon payoff time and reasonable biodiversity impacts. But of course, it's not zero because burning stuff has carbon emitted. I mean, it can't be zero carbon, right? And then the red zone here, the coarse woody debris, includes the majority of the material that is considered to be so-called forestry residues that is burned for energy in the EU. And that is in the red zone for greater than equal emissions as fossil fuels for 100 years or forever. That's the JRC's terminology, not mine. Biomass is increasingly sourced from trees and logs in the EU. The head of the World Bioenergy Association calls these residues. As Sarah pointed out, it's actually a bioperversity. And these are all photographs that were taken at either biomass or wood pellet plants that are supplying the EU. So a couple of them are in the US and Canada. As you can see, this truly massive red cedars on the back of the tree, on the back of a truck there in the British Columbia picture. Those are old growth cedar logs that are being turned into pellets. That's a pellet plant there. But these are all taken either by colleagues of ours or the report that we published that we've linked there has a lot of Google Earth imagery as well, showing gigantic piles of logs at biomass power plants and pellet plants. Just to give you an idea of the scale we're talking about, this is some Google Earth imagery from the United States. A hardwood forest, it's just duplicate pictures through time. A hardwood forest next to a river in North Carolina. These are the kinds of forests that are being logged to make wood pellets that are imported into the UK and the EU and Asia as well. So there it is. Then just after having been clear cut, and then 5 years later, that beautiful, diverse hardwood forest has been replaced by a pine plantation, which is all perfectly legal and classified as sustainable under the current rules for bioenergy sourcing in the EU. Wood pellets from that 27-hectare clear cut would run the Drax power station for 3 hours and 24 minutes. So that's what we're talking about, an insanely inefficient way to generate energy. I mean, if you really wanted to think of a way to pump carbon into the atmosphere as fast as possible, this is pretty much what you would come up with, is cutting down beautiful hardwood forests and liquidating them into the atmosphere. Residential wood burning, which is counted toward the EU's renewable energy targets, is a major source of the air pollution that kills over 1,000 EU citizens per day. 54% of particulate matter is from burning residential solid fuels, which is mostly wood. And 60% of the wood counted toward renewable energy targets is burned for residential heating. The EU is literally subsidizing a technology for clean energy that is killing people. So now let's talk about the sink a little bit. Achieving European Union climate goals relies on increasing carbon uptake in the forest and land sector. All those land uses in the orange zone there are sources of emissions, net sources of emissions to the atmosphere. In the green box are the sectors that take carbon out of the atmosphere or store carbon in the case of harvested wood products. Although, as we just learned, only a tiny fraction of the wood cut down actually ends up in a harvested wood product. The majority of it actually ends up in the atmosphere in relatively short order. As you can see, the forest carbon sink is getting weaker. It means it's getting less negative. So negative numbers in this case are a good thing. You want that line trending downward, but instead it's trending upward. It's becoming much weaker. The forest and land carbon sink is evaporating in the EU, especially in countries like Sweden, Estonia, and Finland that claim to practice sustainable harvesting. Now, here's some new data from Sweden. I think this might be eye-opening to some people who have heard a lot about how wonderful and sustainable Sweden's forest industry is. This is the official statistics. This is their data, not mine. Total growth and total drain. That is data for 2018 that was published this year. I'd sort of like to know where those lines are now. Like, what is the relative magnitude of those two lines? You can see that total drain is about to overtake total growth there. So by 2022, we may be seeing in 2024, when they publish new data, that those lines have actually crossed. There's been a total collapse of the land carbon sink in Finland and Estonia recently. This is new, brand new data here. As you can see, Finland, the red line, which is the total land carbon sink, and the green line, which is the forest sink, have either exceeded or are approaching the zero line. That means it's no longer a sink for carbon, or it's no longer taking carbon out of the air, net carbon out of the air. It's a source. Estonia, same thing. There's been a total collapse. Meanwhile, I want to point out that the CEO of Granule Invest, which is the biggest pellet company, I think, in Europe, it's located in Estonia. The CEO of Granule Invest became pretty much overnight one of Estonia's richest men, based on the billions in subsidies that the European taxpayers are paying out for bioenergy. So he's worth over 200 million euro. And, that's where EU taxpayer money is going. Finland's use of the forest biomass is unequivocally responsible for driving loss of the forest carbon sink. As these three graphs, the graph A shows that all bioenergy, this is heat input basis, exceeds other kinds of renewable energy, wind and hydro here. Graph B shows that this increase was fueled by forest wood, not mill residue. So this is different kinds of wood used for bioenergy. The red line is forest wood. Graph C shows that so much more wood is being burned for energy than used for forest industry products. The Natural Resources Institute of Finland attributed the increased consumption of unprocessed roundwood, which came to a record high level, as responsible for helping to drive that collapse of the forest and land carbon sink in Finland. Likewise, in Estonia, this is just an overlay of total felling data from the Estonian government, and that orange line is the proportion that is clear cutting, so that graphs onto the right-hand axis. The left-hand axis is either the blue bars or the red bars. So the blue bars are total felling, and the red bars are total biomass consumption, including exports. So those wood pellets that Granule Invest has been grinding up Estonia's forests and exporting to other places as so-called clean renewable energy. I want to talk a little bit about some industry myths. The industry likes to talk about sustainable harvesting and the fact that the EU sink is still increasing. And that just means that, basically you're harvesting less than you're growing. But the European Commission impact assessment said that ensuring that the harvest level stays below the growth rate is not sufficient to ensure climate change mitigation. And the IPCC has also similarly said, if something is sustainably harvested, that doesn't mean it's carbon neutral. Yet biomass is still counted under the red as having zero emissions. This is a vestige from when biomass was mostly waste and mill residues, but we need to recognize that this assumption no longer applies, and sawing down trees and burning them in power plants is not reducing emissions. Forest biomass now constitutes about 20% of renewable energy inputs in the EU, so that's about 3% of total energy inputs. That's a lot more, indeed, than wind, solar, all these other kinds of renewable energy. Forest biomass is about half of total wood and half is secondary woody biomass. But I want to point out this is on an input basis. This is the calorific value of the fuel that is being burned. When you look at what is actually coming out the other end as useful energy, though, burning biomass is extremely inefficient. So this top graph shows all biomass burned in the EU, including electricity. That top red line is the energy input, but energy output is the useful heat and electricity from burning that biomass. So there's a big difference between those two lines. And then for electricity only plants, which are average efficiency in the EU of about 31%, the difference is even greater. So the more biomass you burn, the more carbon you're emitting, but you're still only wringing a small amount of energy out of that biomass. The World Bioenergy Association has used confusion about energy inputs and outputs to make misleading claims. They just recently just a few days ago, sent a letter to MEPs that said that biomass energy was equivalent to all energy produced by windmills and photovoltaic systems in Europe combined, and that excluding primary biomass would lead to some kind of catastrophic collapse of the renewable energy targets. But that's simply not true. If you look at the actual energy produced by solid biofuels versus solar and wind and solar is actually 250% the energy produced from biomass, so a lot more. That's good news because it means that this is something that can be replaced pretty easily with truly clean energy. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about residential wood burning. The biomass industry likes to say, look how dependent everyone is. So much of our renewable energy is coming from wood burning, including residential wood burning. We can't take that away. Again, no one is saying that people can't burn wood. We're saying don't count it toward renewable energy targets. And in this case, you really have to feel some compassion for people who are locked into energy poverty and who have to burn wood, because now they're paying twice, especially as energy prices rise. They're competing for wood, they're having to buy wood, and they're competing with power plants that are subsidized to burn wood. And also, because countries are subsidizing wood, they are putting less subsidies into truly clean renewable heating like solar thermal and heat pumps. And if you're having trouble distinguishing solar thermal anywhere on that graph, it's because it's such a tiny, tiny amount that it barely shows up. Likewise, heat pumps. This is a ridiculously low investment in heat pumps. Meanwhile, look at the astounding level of dependency on burning wood. This is not a reason to double down on burning wood. This is a reason to back away from burning wood. And I just want to point out that a 50 megawatt electricity power plant burns 180,000 times a year the wood that a household does. And it would get 16 million per year in subsidies at a subsidy rate of 40 euro per megawatt hour. This is shameful. Subsidizing this is shameful when people are locked into energy poverty. The EU should be doubling down on investments in truly clean energy. Finally, I just want to reinforce the idea. Please remember that meeting energy targets on paper doesn't mean anything if the technology is increasing emissions and destroying forests. There's only one metric that matters when it comes to climate, and that's what does the atmosphere see? What is the net carbon impact on the atmosphere? The EU needs to follow the science and modernize its biomass policy to ensure it only incentivizes biomass that meaningfully reduces emissions in a timely way. This is my contact information, and I really appreciate your attention.
Mary, thank you very much for your presentation. And I followed the discussion in the chat. I think you would need some time to pick up because you were talking to us. So as said, we will have time for questions, and as promised, I'm turning towards the questions now. First, I just want to come back to my additional question, which I raised in my introduction. So we have a ceiling for the use of food and feed-based biocrops in the RED. So I would say, or I would also be interested in hearing from our three panelists before we open the floor. Again, would it maybe be a good idea to put a cap and a face down for counting primary woody biomass as renewable energy on national level in the RED? So at the moment we are in a situation where, and we kind of see this also in our discussion, we have two blocks, we have two sides, and finally we need to overcome it with a solution, with some kind of with some kind of compromise or solution. So I just want to ask our panelists quickly once again the question, if they could quickly reply to this. And then in Daniel, in your remarks on the cascading principle, you showed the prices of different wood products, saying the market guarantees the cascading principle. I have to say, not as optimistic as you about energy, about the energy markets nowadays. And in the graph you showed us, you could see that actually the prices of firewood more than tripled within a year. So we see people now turning to wood ovens, at least in Germany, for example. We see more wood ovens installed than heat pumps. So maybe also a quick question to all. Do you think that the cascading principle will held up by the market? So these two questions for three panelists. And finally, one question to Daniel. You spoke a lot about that bioenergy accounts for a considerable share of renewable energy in the EU. But of course, the status quo is not enough. So we want to quickly upscale renewable energies. Can you give us some numbers about how much fellings of trees would have to be increased to contribute to growth of renewable energy? So two questions to all three participants or panelists, and then one additional to Daniel. And please indicate your question in the chat. Please state to which panelist you are directing the question, and maybe also indicate your organization you are part of, because I have the feeling that we have some organizations here, so for full transparency. So I would ask you to say to which panelist you're directing your question. Please type it, and please let us know for which in the organization you're taking the floor or raising the question, so we have time to collect it, to organize this, and give our panelists a chance to reply. I would ask Sarah to come in first if she wants to say something to the questions I just raised. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Not easy questions, of course. And I don't think anyone here has the answer, but I can give the contribution. I addressed this a little bit, your question about the cap on bioenergy in one of my slides when I was talking about the concept of lock-in. So when any new technology is developed and becomes operational, then of course you have to consider the feedstocks that are required, but not only the feedstocks. So that's the biological lock-in. There's also the societal lock-in, so the workforce that you would need to actually operate that plant, and then the economic dependency. So we're looking at environment, society, and economic let's say, promise for the future anytime that some kind of technology is increasing. That's a general rule, right? And so in the slide that I showed, that was actually addressing the first question, I do mention that. So I don't have an answer as to whether or not a cap is a good solution. We may have, considering how much primary wood is actually used in bioenergy, already overstepped that limit. So a cap might not be fully helpful in reversing any trends. It's probably better than allowing an increase. But there again, I think it's difficult to make a full assessment. This was one of my final points as well, without having, studied the impact of woody biomass for bioenergy from secondary sources, as was in the past, and then and now more recently primary woody sources. So I don't have the answer, but that's my contribution.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Daniel.
Yes, thank you very much. So turning first to the question on the cascading principle and how to go through and apply that properly. The first thing I would point to is that this actually has been something that we've tried in Europe previously. In Sweden, the Wood Fiber Act of 1987 was introduced to go through and regulate cascading at the national level. And what ended up happening was the market became so distorted that the law was actually repealed after just being in force for 6 years. And so there's a real concern about how this would actually be able to operate effectively at the European level. And I would also just like to quote something real quick from the JRC report on page 92. And they go through and they say, the possible regulation of forest bioenergy sources purely on the basis of woody feedstock categories was discussed in details. It was concluded that given the wide variety of situations across member states, it was difficult to unequivocally define and meaningfully implement such restrictions in an EU legislation. The risk would have been to complicate compliance without necessarily fostering further sustainability and biodiversity conservation. And so I think it's difficult to say how this could really be done at a European-wide level effectively, because we do have a situation in where the forest management practices are happening at the national or sometimes even sub-national level because of the immense diversity of the resources that exist. Turning to the additional question that you asked about the caps, I don't think that this would be the right direction to move in. Going through and putting these caps in place especially if it were to lead to a phase down. A lot of this material, as I mentioned, doesn't necessarily have any other uses. And as we were talking about in the JRC report, they did go through and they analyzed some win-win pathways that do go through and utilize primary woody biomass. And going through and looking at some of the pathways, there are certain pathways that are actually already expressly prohibited under the Renewable Energy Directive. And so these are potential pathways that could theoretically happen, but it didn't analyze whether or not those pathways were actually legal and whether they would be happening under RED. And so going through and putting these caps in place, I think is just going to go through and stifle further development, and especially with the forest continuing to grow, then you could end up in a situation where these caps become quite outdated because it doesn't really correspond to the existing level of forest that will be in place in the future. So I think there are a lot of reasons why this policy could end up backfiring, and I don't think it would be the right one to go for. As for your final additional questioning, how much would we need to increase fellings to go through and have the increase we need in bioenergy? Well, looking at the Commission's own data, they're forecasting modest growth in bioenergy, but not dramatic growth. Bioenergy is a much more mature sector than some of the other renewable sectors, which are experiencing much more rapid growth. And what we're really talking about in the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive is whether we should be going through and removing huge portions of bioenergy. And so, we need to be realistic about what can, be sustainably increased. And that is one of the things that is considered in RED. It goes through and it provides that it must comply with LULUCF. It must ensure that forest stocks are remaining stable or increasing. And there are criteria in place to go through and make sure that biodiversity and harvesting metrics are considered and preserved to make sure that this is being done in a sustainable way.
Daniel, thank you so much. And then turning to Marie.
Well, I already said that I thought that a cap wasn't the answer unless the cap basically eliminated use of forest biomass and then capped secondary woody biomass. As Daniel pointed out, the JRC did say it's difficult to meaningfully implement sourcing restrictions based on the variety of feedstocks, which I think is just an argument for getting rid of forest biomass altogether in the red. It's you know, the sustainability criteria don't, as I pointed out, don't do anything about the fact that burning biomass emits carbon a lot faster than trees regrow to sequester it. I mean, it's just crazy to even have to say that. It's so obvious. And yet the biomass industry still argues, like, look over here that, you know, there's still trees growing. And, you know, we've got to look at the actual data. And what the data show is that the sink is collapsing, and the sink is collapsing fastest in the countries that are using the most bioenergy. The EU is setting new land sink targets that will rely on a significant increase in forest carbon uptake to achieve those legislated targets. And instead, we're just moving in the opposite direction, burning more and more wood. I mean, again, nothing about this proposal to remove forest biomass from the red would prohibit people from burning wood. I mean, obviously, we hope that there would be a reduction in burning wood, but you know, people can still burn wood. But what is projected right now, what is the modeling, the EU modeling? I did a deep dive into EU energy modeling and the projections, and in fact, despite Daniel saying that it's projected to only grow a small amount, in fact, the EU energy modeling from a few years ago, 2018, projected a doubling in bioenergy overall and an increase in use of forest biomass by 50%. This would be catastrophic for forests. They're already on their, you know, they're already collapsing. Increasing harvesting even more is exactly the wrong thing to do. I just want to say one more thing about energy security, because I know that's on everyone's mind, and the reduction in fossil fuel imports from Russia. You know, another analysis we did was that it would take a 60% increase in wood burning overall to replace just 10% of the fossil fuels that are imported from Russia. And, you know, since secondary woody biomass is essentially already completely allocated, that increase in wood burning would have to come directly from forests. Again, terrible idea. Let's stop paying people to cut and burn trees for energy and focus that 17 billion or so. Well, it's a little less than that because not all of that is for solid woody biomass, but the billions that would be freed up in subsidies could be reallocated to truly clean energy. So yeah, my answer, no cap, unless it's just, you know, a total elimination of forest biomass and a cap on secondary woody biomass qualifying.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers to my initial questions. So I'm following the chat. I would ask everyone to to stay professional. No one is considering anyone as stupid, Jean-Marc, so please limit yourself a bit. This would help. And as I said, I now turn to the questions, and I am using the questions where I can see for which organization it's raised, as I said. So this is necessary for transparency reasons. And the one who is doing it very good is Klaus Hennenberg from the Öko Institute. He's very transparent about it, so I honor that and start with his question, which is, I think, directed to Sarah. He asked, the result of the Öko Institute research supports that the carbon content of the wood should be included in the greenhouse gas balances. Would this be an option for the RED 3 methodology? I hope I read it out correctly. And Sarah, if you would like to comment on that, it would be great.
Okay. I don't see that question, but if I understood it correctly, whether or not to include carbon accounting into the harvested wood products for the to count towards the RAD, right? Okay. Well, we have to then again consider the whole landscape of legislation, so that we already have the LULUCF regulation, so we remember that. I think one main point is the idea is nice, but try and do it. It's really not simple. So how would you operationalize that? How would that actually work? Because it would require a lot of assumptions. For example, you would have to have a benchmark. You would have to have agreement on that across all member states. That would be difficult. Also considering that there are different wood types, and that those wood types have different densities and different carbon content according to where they're growing. So it is. I think that was actually considered at one point, at one stage during the deliberations, but operationally it's very difficult. I admit I'm not a life cycle or a harvested wood products expert on this, but as far as I understand it, it's difficult to implement. But maybe not a bad idea. If we can get together and actually try and study a way to do that, it would actually be quite a fascinating, yeah, and actually have added value to our knowledge base in general about how much carbon really is stored and for how long in harvested wood products. Because we have to remember, you produce them, but then they are eventually then disposed of, and then how long does each wood product last? So all of these questions would have to be addressed in that kind of an endeavor.
Okay, thank you very much. So then we have another question by Mr. Fagerblom on behalf of the Finnish Forest Industry Federation, or at least he's working there. So to whoever wants to answer, so this goes to all three of you. Is it so that primary biomass is renewable when decaying in the forest or staying in the forest and rotting there and releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, but not renewable if it's utilized to substitute fossil energy, offering jobs and income and keeping houses warm? So a quite direct question. And Daniel, Mary, who would you like to start?
Sure, I can start, I guess. No, I mean, looking at this, I think it's quite clear that when we're looking at the use of this primary woody biomass, that if it has gone through and left in the forest, it will decompose and release the same carbon into the atmosphere. And depending on what kind of biomass that is, if it's, fine debris, that can even decompose as quickly as like 2 or 3 years. Obviously, with some larger biomass, it takes a longer time, but some of this does actually decompose relatively quickly. And so the whole point of having the biogenic carbon, the reason why bioenergy is considered to be carbon neutral, is because you do have that regrowth, that this is just going through and it's taking so carbon that is stored in woody biomass that is going to be released into the atmosphere anyways, and going through and getting some sort of energy benefit from that. So it's not going through and creating any new carbon emissions from the ground like fossil fuels do. And that's why we have these criteria in place under RED to go through and say that it should be considered renewable.
My answer to that would be that the concept of renewability applies to energy. And so and not to ecosystem processes. So it's kind of a moot question to ask whether it's renewable if it's lying and decomposing in the forest, because by definition, it's not being used for renewable energy. So But I would point out, first of all, that no one is actually burning fine woody debris in power plants or for firewood or for wood pellets. In fact, wood pellets are overwhelmingly sourced either from mill residues, like clean mill residues, or reasonably sized round wood that is big enough to go through a debarking machine, because pellets have to have kind of a minimal amount of bark, because bark contains a lot of minerals, and when you burn it, it kind of fouls up emissions controls. So for wood pellets are typically made from round wood that has been debarked. And so fine woody debris is just not something that is actually burned for energy very much, but it is really important to keep it in the forest, as it's the basis of the food chain. It adds to soil carbon. It provides habitat. It provides cover for the soil so that there's less erosion. It keeps the soils moist and keeps them from drying out. And we all know that we want our forests to be a lot more moist. So really, I kind of dispute the basis of the question at all, but I do appreciate that it gave me a chance to talk about, as an ecologist, the importance of retaining fine woody debris in the forest.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you very much. And Sarah, would you also like to?
Yes, sure. So I think that we're still focusing on carbon, the carbon debate, which, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, is really because it's actually can be quantified. It's usually what is used as an argument, but we have to also consider the ecological benefits of fine woody debris. Also, we tend to neglect that fine woody debris is very bulky, and in like a practical example, if you have to actually send in machinery to bundle that and put it on the roadside and then transport it, so the emissions are not only related to the direct, combustion, but also to that, the transport element is just something that obviously it doesn't teletransport to the facility. It has to be moved there somehow. But a point in favor of using fine woody debris, of course, we are always talking about geographically specific rules. And if you think of countries like Portugal and Spain, where there are forest fires and actually fine woody debris contributes to that, then you have to think that it is not of benefit always to leave fine woody debris in the forest, but that is something very local and has to be considered.
Except that these fires are being driven by climate. And what we see in the United States, I mean, there's not a lot of data on this in Europe, but what we are seeing in the United States is that the more intensively managed forests and logged forests, even forests that have been cleared supposedly for fire control, are actually burning with the same frequency and as hot or hotter than unmanaged forests that tend to be cooler and damper. So really have to be careful what we say about what's actually driving fires these days.
Okay, understood. Thank you very much. I will also I'll try to squeeze in one or two more questions. First of all, a quick answer to just a second, Mr. Borowski on behalf of EU state forests. Yes, indeed, we are. Of course, we are also discussing with forest owners, no worries, and we are focusing here on the energy side and on the energy questions. This is why we composed the panel as it is. But I'm happy to see so many stakeholders also for the forest owners associations here. And I'll also take a question on board from you from Fanny on behalf of I don't know how to pronounce this, Langue, Langue. So there was a question by you. Just give me a second. I have to scroll a bit. Here you go. And it was directed to Mary. What is your view on biomass market offering opportunities to forest owners of small scale holdings to actually manage their forest? For example, support the cost of cleaning operations that forest owners may not carry out if material would not have any economic value. So, Mary, would you like to answer the question directed to you?
I'm not a forest economist, So my answer is basically, again, no one is prohibiting anyone from burning wood or using wood in any way. What the proposal is to stop counting burning wood toward renewable energy targets. And in fact, my experience here in the US is that landowners get really a pretty, even under subsidized bioenergy, the amount of money that landowners get for biomass coming off their land is really low. I mean, the value tends to be in the saw timber. It depends. I mean, it depends on the relative volumes taken out, but I don't think that, monetizing clearing is really what the RED should be doing. I mean, the RED is not a forest management piece of legislation. It's a piece of energy legislation, and it's about reducing emissions. And burning biomass, including coarse woody debris and fine woody debris, increases emissions more than fossil fuels. That's physics. And so the RED should not be incentivizing something and paying people to do more of something that's increasing emissions. What happens with forest management is a separate question that needs to be dealt with in separate legislation. The EU has set new goals in the biodiversity strategy and the forest strategy about renaturalizing forests and bringing nature back into our lives, and managing ecosystems and forests in a different way to restore nature that is really, biodiversity is really crashing and the carbon sink is really crashing. Those priorities, need to be exercised through that legislation. The RED is not a forest management tool.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that Sarah and Daniel do not want to come in on this question, so we would have no, they're not interrupting me. That's good. So I take this as consent. And so I would have the chance. I know we are technically out of time, but I would like to bring in one more question by Alexander Bachler, which was directed also to Mary, but I think this can be addressed by all three of you once again. The question is, please tell us how member states will be able to achieve their renewable energy targets without counting biomass as renewable energies. He does not know how. Does anyone on the panel know how? So this would be the final question then. And I think it's a question which comes up very often. So I think this would be great to address it once more. So Mary, as it was originally directed to you, I would invite you to start, but then I would invite also Daniel and Sarah to come in on this question.
Well, as I addressed in my presentation, first of all, the renewable energy targets are not what's important. What's important is actually reducing CO2 emissions to the atmosphere when we're talking about climate change. And so that's a paper target. And, basically, I don't think that should take priority over figuring out ways to actually reduce emissions. So I'm less concerned if member states don't hit their targets. Now, obviously, member states are concerned. I think that there needs to be a wealth redistribution where the subsidies currently going toward bioenergy need to be massively redistributed toward truly clean renewable energy. And in fact, that would be one of the chief benefits. It's a real true win-win. You take some of the pressure off of forests, and you free up a lot of subsidies that you can then pour into truly clean renewable energy. And it's really all hands on deck now. I think everyone realizes after this summer how truly urgent it is that we stop pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. You're talking about burning wood that increases emissions, according to the European Commission's own scientists, increases emissions compared to fossil fuels for decades to centuries when you're burning wood. Why would we pay people to do that under a piece of legislation that is supposed to reduce emissions?
Thank you for this clear message. Who wants to go next? Daniel or Sarah? Daniel?
Okay,
Nope.
I can come in, sure. Okay. Well, I mentioned the concept of human ingenuity. I think that there are ways, if we can send people to the moon twice, then we can figure it out. In the sense, I have to agree with Dr. Booth on this, that the targets that we set on paper, we should be intelligent enough as a species to be able to understand whether or not those targets are realistic if they're man-made. Whereas what's happening in the biosphere is something that has gone completely out of control. So just as we completely reset our lives for the pandemic, and I don't want to sound like a crazy lady, but we showed ourselves that we are able to completely shift paradigm in the way we live for 2 years. Why don't we try harder? I think that's something that it's too easy to refer to targets and say, well, we have to reach those targets without thinking about whether or not they're reasonable and whether or not there might be alternative ways to reach them. And I have to correct Mary on this, because you've said many times that the EU is subsidizing that. As far as I know, no EU money goes into subsidizing incentives. This is was part of my last message. That it's really a member state.
Taxpayer money.
Right,
It's
but it's not EU is
money
paying. EU is not paying anything. EU is not doing that, right? So I think it's just important to be clear for the audience here. Okay, and that's why it's the member state level of governance is really important at this point. So to find solutions to reach targets, to find solutions in how to best handle their ecological, social, and economic situation.
Okay, thank you. And Daniel, then the last statement of today's session goes to you.
Thank you. Yes, so just to talk real quick about the subsidy point, I mean, this is an issue that is addressed at the member state level, and the situation is very complex with regards to the energy sector. And we do see actually that per like megawatt hour, that bioenergy receives half the subsidies that fossil fuels receive. Fossil fuels still receive quite a lot of subsidies from member states. And especially now, as we're looking at the soaring gas prices, we see lots of efforts to go through and to further subsidize the use of fossil fuels. And especially when you compare the amount of subsidies that bioenergy receives from member states to the amount of subsidies given to other renewables, per kilowatt hour produced, it's significantly lower for what bioenergy receives. Talking about how we're going to be able to go through and meet these targets, well, that is something that I would be concerned about, because when we look at it, we still have the vast majority of our energy system being supplied by polluting fossil sources that are going to continue emitting carbon that's been stored for millions of years into the atmosphere. And I think we do need to scale up all sorts of different renewable technologies. But the fact of the matter is that we will not be able to be at 50, 80% renewable energy tomorrow. And if we're going through and we're going to exclude primary woody biomass from being able to count as renewable, well, in the short term, the only real viable solution that I can imagine being implemented is other fossil fuels, and replacing the amount of energy that we get from primary woody biomass with fossil fuels. That would be roughly the equivalent of 40 billion cubic meters of gas. And so that would be, I think, a very bad outcome. And so we need to definitely consider the trade-offs. We need to go through and make sure that we're doing this in a smart way that's positive for the climate. But I do believe that bioenergy does need to continue to be part of the solution. And that's how we're going to be able to go through and move forward on this.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank our panelists for talking much longer than agreed. So we are already over time. Thank you very much for taking this additional time. Obviously, we haven't found the silver bullet yet, but we have still 2 weeks to do so. And I think this discussion was also facilitating this process. So thank you very much. I just want to get 2 things straight. Yes, in the end, it's taxpayers' money, no matter what, if it's from the member states or the European Union. I think we agree on that. So we have to be careful about that. So also, of course, the red is not about regulating forests, but I think this is also something we need to into account. The red should obviously, in my opinion, not incentivize the destruction of forests. So this is also what I saw in the last comments here. I just wanted to underline that. And then once again, I think all groups in the parliament are really committed to find a common approach, a common solution. Of course, it's not for granted that we will be able, but majorities will be very tight. And I think we all learned during the ETS regulation that it is not very good to rely on changing majorities and majorities found by accident. So I think the importance of the matter really calls for all policymakers, and we are committed to do so, to try to find a solution before the vote, so to have a stable majority, a coherent approach. We are working on that, and I would like to thank once again Sarah, Mary, and Daniel to take the time and to help us to find a solution which may work for a solid majority. So once again, thank you very much, and thanks for participants staying longer and for tuning in. I wish you a good weekend, and I'm sure that we will be in contact over the next couple of days until the vote in plenary. Thanks again, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.